Tony Juniper, so nice of you to interview for the book, A Restored Earth, 10 Paths to a Hopeful Future. You've done so much, Tony, and I wanted to ask you, what gives you hope? What makes you optimistic about the cause we're engaged in?
Well, I think the main thing is that things actually do change. And if you look back over 40 years when there's been serious environmental work going on, being pushed by NGOs and being received by governments and companies being urged to do things differently, things actually are being done quite differently now compared to several decades ago. So I think we draw optimism from the fact that things do change. But on a day-to-day basis, it's quite hard to see that, especially when things appear to go backwards temporarily, as they always do. But if you look at the long trajectory, then I think you can see positive change taking place. And so I think that really should be a source of encouragement for everybody involved in all of this. Of course, that pace of positive change is at the same time being overwhelmed by the growing scale of demand arising from a bigger population that's on average richer. And of course, the speed with which the change is taking place, the positive change, is being preceded by the environmental change, which is running in front of it. And so look at the climate change example, and you see that, yes, we now do have a consensus that we need to decarbonise. We do have some growth in renewable energy, but at the same time we have massive rising demand and CO2 accumulating in the atmosphere in a way which is not compatible with a 2-degree outcome. So this is about urgency and how we scale up what we're doing, I would say, rather than offering a counsel of despair, which I don't think would help anybody.
And one of the things I've always admired about you, Tony, is that you are optimistic. You don't focus on the doom and gloom, you focus on what we can do to make a difference. And I see that in all of your work and in your writing too. Is that a theory of change?
I don't know about theory of change. It just seems to be sensible in the way in which you might be able to encourage people to join in. And I think quite a lot of the environmental message over the years has been disempowering. It's not been wrong in the sense of pointing out the very challenging implications of the data we've got around a whole different range of subjects. But if you just put that to people, then one of the natural reactions is for them either to say, well, there's nothing I can do, or I don't care, or it's too late. And all of those reactions are really not helpful. So I think it is very, very important to focus on the positives, as well as at the same time letting people know that we do have some serious issues to deal with. But I think if you do this just one way and offer the negative side of it, I think actually this is counterproductive. There's a tricky communications challenge there, though, and it is about human psychology, because you do need people to understand that something has to be done for a reason. It's not just because we're, like the birds or the bees or whatever. It's actually for reasons that are more fundamental to any personal preferences that naturalists might have that translate into conservation. This is about something which, has really kind of big implications. And being able to deliver that at the same time as the positive message is really quite a fine line to walk, but it's one that I think we have to focus on. And indeed, I think I'd go so far as to say that quite a lot of the climate scepticism that we saw in the period from 2009 to about 2014, it became very insurgent, that line of thinking that actually it's not really true, don't worry about it too much, it's a big mistake. I think that found fertile ground upon which to fall, because people had been given the impression that it was pretty hopeless, it was far too big for them to deal with. And that was made worse by some of the campaigning that was, deliberately or not, making people feel guilty. And so if you feel the world is doomed and that it's your fault, then you probably would be tempted to conclude that it's not true. If someone told you that, it would be tempting to believe the skeptics. And so I think that there was some fuel put into the tanks of the deniers by the high concentration of doom in the messages coming from the climate campaigners over a period of years.
So just self-fulfilling prophecy in a way.
Yes. So you have to be careful about that, and but not diminish the urgency or the scope and scale of what's going on, because it is absolutely huge. But it needs to be done in this way where some sense of hope is created. What's more difficult is creating a sense of agency for people, because whenever you get into this and you explain the big picture to people, the natural question is, well, what can I do? And that is where it actually gets even more challenging than being optimistic, because a lot of what people can do is actually quite small in the greater scheme, and how you balance that call for collective action with people feeling they've got a sense of influence themselves, that's another one. And those two together, the optimism versus the pessimism, and the sense of personal agency versus the collective action, these things are actually quite difficult to get individually correct, and when you put them together it's even more difficult. But that's the place where we need to be operating, I think. It's quite a precise area, but it can be done as people, they do this, you can see it happening.
Chapter 9 of my book is about what you can do as an individual, and I want to talk about some great things that people are doing individually and also at the level of their community. But Chapter 10 is about what we need to do internationally and a new international environmental architecture and the like. In Chapter 10 I want to write that we need a kind of global Marshall Plan for our times to address the environmental challenges, and I want to describe how in other spheres of human activity we've established big global partnerships to address HIV/AIDS, antimicrobial resistance, etc. Could we do that same thing for? Have we already done that with Paris and the SDGs, or do we?
I think Paris was an enormously important breakthrough, but it was a breakthrough in the sense of the world has now agreed something must be done, and the next bit is now doing what must be done, which is a whole different level of complexity and challenge, because this is where you come down to real decisions with real people involved and real vested interests who need to be convinced or moved along, and so. We have the blueprint, but how we actually turn that into something on the ground is still a very challenging piece, and that's what we have to do next. And looking at parallels on the climate thing, never mind the biodiversity and the resources and soils and everything else, but on the climate change thing, it's been the case that for some years people have been looking for parallels with other things that have changed in the world, and actually the closest one that I've got to, I think, is the circumstances that prevailed during the beginning of the Second World War, when you had a group of countries, the United States and Britain among them, who basically took quite a complacent view about an emerging threat. And there were people making warnings, saying this is going to get nasty, something needs to be done by way of preparation, and it was left too late. And then we had the outbreak of the war in Europe, followed by the attack on Pearl Harbor. And the reaction was very rapid once the threat was appreciated. And so what you saw, I think, is under three headings in both the US and the UK. You saw the very rapid mobilisation of technology, so new submarines and aeroplanes and everything else. You saw very visible political leadership in the form of Winston Churchill and President Roosevelt, and you had very strong public backing for action to the point where people were volunteering to go and fight. And so all of that, I think, is parallel in terms of what you might expect from climate change action. We need visible political leadership, we've got to mobilise technology, and it needs public backing. But the difference between what happened at the beginning of the Second World War and what's now happening on climate change is the perception of the threat. And so if you've got fleets of bombers in the Pas de Calais, then people in the UK, they kind of know something has to be done and they mobilise. On the climate issue, it's slightly different because we have this difficulty of it being perceived as being slightly over the horizon. It isn't, of course, it's upon us now, we can see that. But nonetheless, that's the perception that some people still hold. And of course, that's been made worse by this deliberate creation of confusion by some of the climate change deniers, some of whom now have very prominent roles in the government of the United States, which is slightly troubling. Yes, a fifth column takeover, and Major Quisling has seized the White House is one way you could look at this.
This is a big worry, although we have some hope that Ivanka Trump is sympathetic on climate, but we'll see.
Maybe she should do something. So the parallels are important, but I struggle to find one on the climate piece. And if you think about HIV/AIDS, well, that's good. The partnerships came there, but this is so much bigger, so much bigger. And it is challenging to see, what we might learn from. I think that remains a question, but those elements, the technology piece, the public support and the political leadership, I think they stand.
You've also been very good, Tony, at making economic arguments for doing the right thing by nature. And some environmentalists, like Michael McCarthy and others, have come around to the view that we need to just argue about the intrinsic value of nature. But I think what you've done brilliantly is to try to make the argument also the economics stack up in favour of doing the right thing.
Yes, and I think it's very important to use that word also, because some of the critics of the kind of frame of natural capital have suggested that if you take that view, then you diminish the importance of the intrinsic or the moral or the spiritual perspectives, and I don't think that's right. I think they've got that wrong, and that is problematic to my estimation, because the main problem we've got is not a lack of understanding of the intrinsic value, the difficulty we face is how pretty much every decision in the world is framed by economics. It's not framed by the intrinsic value of nature. And unless we can find a way of showing everyone that actually the integrity of the natural world is essential for economic development, I think we continue to lose, because the misconception is there for all to see pretty much all the time, whereby big decisions around infrastructure or farming or whatever it is very often go through a discussion around environmental impact, is it acceptable or not, and then there being some calculation as to whether we can find a balance between environmental damage and economic growth. And always, of course, that balance, in inverted commas, goes in favour of short-term financial objectives or economic objectives, and so we continue to lose all these battles with roads being put through rainforests, new coal mines opened, everything else. So unless we can locate the ecological argument inside the economic one, or better still the other way round, for economics to be seen as it truly is, a subsection or a kind of wholly owned subsidiary of ecology, then we will continue to lose, because that's the way political decisions and policy dynamics work. It's always favouring the economic. So this is a highly strategic argument to my thinking, but it's not one that supplants the others. They can coexist. Mm-hmm. And a lot of people say, well, this is impossible, but actually this is not true. And if you think about it for a nanosecond, you realise that already the world is operating on several levels in terms of how it chooses to express the point of conservation. Some of it is very emotional, some of it is very scientific, some of it is more practical. Mm-hmm. So we're already operating on several levels, but it's not very strategic, it's piecemeal, and it's not cutting through into the places where it needs to, which is in those places where economic decisions are being made.
Very clear. I have a number of positive case studies in my book. One is what the Colombian government has done with its indigenous people, which is not perfect, but it's a very inspiring example about the Amazon conservation. I've got a discussion of what Ethiopia is doing with restoring degraded landscapes. There's examples on biodiversity conservation in northern Kenya, inspiring work in cities, in Bogota, the waste campaigners in Britain doing amazing things. But I wanted to ask for you, as solar panels in Nevada, but are there 3 or 4 case studies, stories that have particularly struck you, either domestically or internationally, that you think would be worth writing about?
Well, there's quite a few around, and actually I think it's really, really important to spread these. So I recently had a trip to the Ivory Coast to look at the cocoa business on the ground there, and was impressed by the extent to which at least one major multinational chocolate company has begun to understand that the future of its business is tied up with the future of the farmers and indeed the future of the forests. And so you can see some emerging plans there that are trying to join up the social and the economic and the environmental agendas in ways which make perfect sense. It's early days, but I'm quite encouraged, in fact very encouraged by the way in which a very large company, which would previously have been seen as a capitalist entity that was externalising all of its damage, has actually now understood that this cannot continue, and for business reasons. And so that, I think, is good insofar as you can now see glimmers in the business community around the reality that they face, that this stuff isn't for somebody else and it can't be ignored for later. It's got to be dealt with now, and it's got to have proper investment in the solutions. So that's good in terms of tropical country smallholders. There's been some encouraging progress, I think, on the water side, both in this country and across the world, where people are beginning to restore ecosystems that clean and catch and store water and release it into the environment, replenishing aquifers. So you can see this in New York State, where some years ago big-scale landscape restoration was put in place in order to deliberately improve the water supply, but crucially at lower cost. And you can see some of that in the UK, in South West Water, United Utilities, Wessex Water, various companies looking at ecosystems and the land and systems like blanket bogs as being essential for a secure water supply. And so, again, you can see a business case emerging there. What else can be said? There's quite a few good examples on marine fisheries as well, where people have put 2 and 2 together and understood that if you destroy the ecosystem, then ultimately you're going to destroy the source of welfare of the fish. And if the fish can't eat and breed, then of course there's not going to be many fish. So looking at the ecosystem being part of the way in which you sustain a valuable product and food security through that route, again, it looks like some people's eyes are beginning to open in quite good ways.
Fantastic. And David Attenborough's just done this wonderful programme on cities and on nurturing the environment in cities, which is something I want to discuss quite a lot in my chapter on cities. I mean, there's hope if we can have proper environmental concern within cities.
Yes, indeed. No, the cities is a hugely important piece, and actually the programme that David Attenborough put out the other evening was very inspiring and showing that it's not just a few small birds that you can have living in cities, and things like leopards and quite big animals that are big only to coexist with people. But we need to design our cities in order to be able to do this and to be facilitating that wildlife dimension. And again, it can be done. You look around where places have been master planned with this in mind at the beginning. There's one small town in Cambridgeshire called Camborne that had that. It was built on some pretty poor wheat fields, poor from the point of view of biodiversity. And as a result of designing this place around some of the remaining features, including hedgerows and small woods, and then rebuilding some of the natural areas that were missing in terms of grasslands and putting in new ones like small lakes. This place is an incredibly nice place to live now, and it's full of wildlife. And that shows you, I think, that not only is it possible to do it, but the benefits are not only for the birds and the butterflies, but also for the people living there. And so that place is one of the most popular places to live, and interestingly has got one of the highest birth rates in the British Isles, which, talking of optimism, probably is saying something about the environment and the way in which it's making people feel in terms of their future. And that essential connection between green space, wildlife, water, we know from a lot of science now is essential for human well-being. And so building this into cities is not simply about the wildlife, it's also about the people. And again, there's a kind of circularity to this, a bit like the economic argument, whereby you can paint a more compelling picture by looking at the wider view of it all than you could simply by saying we need some more birds. But it can be done, and it's got benefits at many levels.
You also see a relationship between, I think, the environment and the issue of inequality in recent conversation of ours, and how you potentially campaigns on both could be mutually complementary.
Well, they should be, and the reason I think, the inequality, I think if you kind of just reel back and look at all of these different issues we're trying to deal with, I think you would be quite justified in concluding that the biggest environmental issue of all is these huge disparities between people. And so how does that work in practice? Well, very, very kind of simply, there's not enough to go round for everybody to be living like Donald Trump, for example, flying their own aeroplane about and consuming like that. It simply won't work. There's not enough planet to do it on. And so if there's going to be any sense of justice in the world, we probably can't expect stability and harmony to occur if a tiny minority are living like that and the vast majority either struggling or worse still in really quite poor conditions of poverty. And so if we are going to end poverty, we need to create some space by sharing the ecological pie out a little bit more fairly. So there's that piece of it, a very practical piece, and then you've got another piece which is about the politics of it and the extent to which it is very difficult to pass laws and regulations to improve the environment when it's perceived that a poor group in society is going to be disproportionately impacted. And so in this country, renewable energy has been under relentless attack because of the higher prices that poor consumers will have to pay. Whereas if you go to Sweden, where the society is much more equal, that political dynamic isn't playing. There isn't a sense of unfairness. It's a question of us all being in the same boat and all seeing the same problem and therefore all being able to sign up to a broadly similar programme. But the more unequal a country, the worse that becomes and the more difficult it is to do anything which looks like it might be increasing the costs for poor people. And so, these are quite deep-seated problems, but they need to be there. And, and also an appreciation alongside those two questions is the psychological effect of inequality. And there is this psychological phenomenon of positional consumption, whereby if you're feeling as though you're looking a bit poor, you try and consume more in order to catch up with the people who look like they're a bit richer. And so this encourages behaviour which isn't necessarily rational, but which is based upon the fact that some people feel as though they're looking less well off than others, and they try to look more well off and they buy a load of shit they don't need in order to be able to kind of close that gap, positional consumption. And then another piece of this is to do with psychology. It's kind of related to that, but to do with the psychological dimensions of it. And a phenomenon called status anxiety, which is linked with people who feel inferior in some way because of the extent to which there's a lot of people obviously doing better than they are. And so this then confers a cost on society in terms of mental health problems and everything else. So all of this bundles up into really quite a big set of problems, but which are rarely on the agenda. And, what's actually interesting at the moment is how that juxtaposition of environment and social equity used to be the domain of the political left, but what we've seen in some parts of the world, and an increasing tendency towards this, is how populist right-wing movements, and Donald Trump's a good example, have managed to make an argument that's appealing to the least well-off in society and doing it with an anti-environmental dimension to it as well. This is very strange. And I think anybody who's advocating for a fairer and greener world needs to try and understand this and to really work out what's happened there, because something really quite bad is going on. And if we can't fathom that, then I think the problems are going to be much more difficult to deal with.
Yes, and maybe the politics there are about a love of place, people feeling proud in a benign way about the beauties of the country they inhabit, or the precious nature of the natural environment.
It could be that. I think what's being tapped into there, and also in the Brexit debate, is the anger of people feeling left behind. So it's the inequality piece which is coming through, but the irony is that it's being captured and exploited by extremely wealthy and privileged people. As I say, with an anti-environmental bent to what they're saying as well. But this is politics, and I think those of us who want to do something about all this are going to need to work out what that is and how to respond to it. And one of the things you learn from fishing is when the method you're using isn't working, try something else. And it remains to be seen if the political left in the US or anywhere else actually can begin to understand the dimensions of a different strategy. I don't see it yet, not in the UK at least.
You do a lot, Tony, in multiple contexts, because you write, you speak, you campaign, you are president of the Wildlife Trust and many other things. So, and you've also advised companies on how to behave better. So I feel that, and you've also stood for election. So I think you've tried to change the world through multiple contexts. You've also been a long-standing friend of Prince of Wales.
Yes, it tried everything, I think, probably is what it feels a little bit like. And all of these methods, of course, are valid. But the more we go along, the more you realise that, some of the stuff we focus on around the science and the policy, these are very important. But actually, the more important thing is what the people are thinking, who you're talking to. And the people are thinking very often on the basis not so much of information but feeling. And one of the things I've come to think is probably true over the years is that whenever a person is confronted between a choice between head and heart in terms of I've got some information here but I'm feeling this over here, then generally the heart and how people feel is what wins and what kind of guides behaviour. And so across all the things you're kind enough to mention in terms of writing and helping companies and everything else, the thing I think we need to foster is a feeling that people want to engage with this and want to do something about it, which takes us back to our first question and that point of optimism and how you get people to feel as though actually yes, I can get involved with this and I want to do something and I'll help, rather than thinking these people are annoying me, they are blaming me, they're making me depressed. All of these things, if you make people feel like that, then even if they got information, they probably won't respond positively.
Whereas if they feel that they could be agents of change, there's still a lot to fight for and protect.
Agents of change, their friends will like them, they will get a girlfriend, whatever it is. Whatever it is that's going to make them feel good, I think is the kind of thing that we need to know better.
Very interesting. I wanted to ask you about what you think on the religion question, and we noted with great interest the Pope's encyclical last year and the fact that many of the world's people are devout, and could the religions be doing more? Are they already doing a lot?
Well, they could and they should, but they find it difficult for whatever reason, and I don't know what that is, although I suspect it's got something to do with their theology drifting quite far from their roots, and they've arrived, like everybody else, in a capitalist, industrialised society, and I think some of the faiths, they try and pander to that rather than to question it. And this is down to centuries of evolution of ideas. And you go back to the beginning the Christian faith, or at least in the early medieval period, and it was it was much more focused on creation and nature, with God dwelling in all of the beautiful things. And,
yes.
And then later on, as a result of the Enlightenment and then the rise of the capitalist economy, God comes to sit on a cloud and kind of preside down upon us, rather than us being in the presence of all this wonderful life and miraculous existence that prevails here on the earth. And so we now have religious teaching which is disconnected from nature and our dependence upon it, and in the worst excesses, it's seen as like a good idea to be able to trash it in order to meet human needs, or in the case of some of the more bizarre manifestations of Christianity in the United States, it's like, it's God's will to end the world, therefore let's hasten it. So there are some dimensions to the faiths which are really not helpful, but they should be helpful and they could be helpful, and perhaps if they understood their roots more fully, they would be able to see this. And this is not even to mention the moral dimension of all of these things. And you would hope that if anywhere there was a source of moral leadership, it would be coming from the great faiths, in terms of why we might want to conserve the earth for future generations, never mind it being God's creation and therefore you'd hope sacrosanct. But they don't say that, and they certainly don't behave like it.
So much more to be done there.
Yeah.
Just as there is teaching and young people and education. And
yes, well, this is one of the most important things, and this is where I began my career actually back in the 1980s. Was working on a project with primary school children in Oxfordshire, working with wildlife trusts, and that groundwork. We neglect that really at our peril, because that is one of the most important things, is equipping people not only with the knowledge but also with the mindset of being able to see ourselves as fundamentally connected to the natural world. And this is David Attenborough's point actually in his final sign-off on the Planet Earth 2 programme, talking about the need for us to be connected. Say, even in our industrialised and urbanised world, but actually especially in our industrialised and urbanised world, because the simple reality is, of course, that everything we're consuming in the middle of London here is coming from nature.
Yes.
And that fact is less and less visible to people in a day-to-day sense. And so forging that connection and starting with young children is absolutely vital for resolving all of these problems. Otherwise, we're going to have people who not only don't get it intellectually, they won't get it emotionally. And as I say, the emotional piece, I think, probably is the more important part of the whole thing, is in terms of how people feel. Do they feel that it's a problem that a butterfly habitat at the edge of the town is being destroyed? They may hear and know some numbers about this as the last of 6 colonies or whatever they would hear, but actually, do they care? And that caring piece comes from experience. And so this investment in small children, or young, well, everybody actually, but children are the ones, we can get them early in life, I think is really vital. And in this country, of course, we've had attempts to downgrade the prominence of these kinds of discussions in the national curriculum. Again, conservative-minded politicians who think these things are, something that's not part of the modern political agenda, and try to undermine this. So there's a battle to be had even there in terms of how we're going to reach young people. But people doing good work on all of that, of course.
Certainly. So how long have we got to turn this round, Tony? Have we got 5 years, 100 years, 50 years, 20 years?
I don't know. It could already be too late, and we might have a decade. I don't think we've got 50 years, and I certainly don't think we have 100.
So we've got to throw everything at it.
We've got to throw everything at it now. We've got to throw everything at it now, and we have to see that it's a multi-layered piece, and it's not just the CO2. That's vitally important. But it's the living fabric of the planet, the biodiversity and the ecosystems, which we massively underestimate the value of. And then it's about the people and how we're going to triangulate some kind of shift in consciousness between these ecological challenges to get to where we need to get to. And, as we discussed a moment ago, one of the places where I think, we've got the most effective vehicle is economic policy. This comes as, an unwelcome message to some environmentalists, but I think it's right if you just kind of look at the scale of what's needed and how we're going to do it. We're going to need to be moving money, finance, infrastructure planning in a different direction, and that's not going to come from ecology, that's going to come from economy. The argument will be ecological, but the vehicle will be economics.
Very clear, very clear. And there is a very strong economic case for doing the right thing by the climate.
Exactly. And in its own terms, exactly.
Yeah,
The economic case is not one where you even need to change the fundamentals of capitalism. If you just start to look at this with all of the information on the table rather than some of the information on the table, which is what we do now, and especially if you look a few decades out, then you see this is a no-brainer. We should be doing this very quickly for economic reasons, never mind the panda or the tiger. This is something which is about the future of human society and the extent to which it will be able to meet its needs, which is what economics is all about, I'm told.
Very good. Well, Tony, thank you so much. It's a great
Pleasure.
Inspiration to work with you on these things and to have done so for 10 years. So
likewise.
We'll continue and
Yes.
very much hope to continue to work together
Yes,
on this
indeed.
course for the rest of our lifetimes.
We certainly will. We'll look forward to final victory, whatever it may be.
Yes, exactly. Thanks so much, Tony.
Very good, Ed.